small rural town of Gee's Bend, Alabama was one with a legacy of quilt makers that descended from generation to generation from the time prior to the African Americans' emancipation from slavery through the end of their oppression from the heavily white populations of neighboring towns that provided economic support to the meager opportunities in their own home. During the 1960s, the largely black population of Gee's Bend was physically cut off by removal of their ferry service from the neighboring town of Camden, whose main trade-off with Gee's Bend was their sustaining food, medicine, and supplies that the residents of Gee's Bend depended on to survive. The women of the town decided to provide their artistic abilities in quilt making as an alternative to other sources of income, so the people of the town began to depend on the quilts as their economic support during the oppression from the white economies surrounding them. Despite their conditions, the town was able to show economic resilience through several generations of racial, economic, and physical oppression, with the ultimate dependence of their economy on the quiltmakers' income. In 1966, the formation of the Freedom Quilting Bee provided the women of Gee's Bend with an environment in which economic opportunities were provided for African American women through quilt sales. This cooperative was one that inspired the traditions and legacies that are now seen in the women's quilts, including the recycling of materials from local Gee's Bend, such as cotton, denim, polyester, and fabrics taken from clothing or furniture seen around town. The local past of Gee's Bend was ingrained in the quilts, providing warmth and tradition to the community. Mary Lee Bendolph was born in rural Gee's Bend in 1935, descending from generations of quilt makers who provided for their families through their artistic manifestations of family legacies. Throughout the oppression that she suffered from during the civil rights movements, she made it her personal motivation to dedicate herself to civil rights and the promotion of African American and economic progress in her small hometown. Her inspirations of personal oppression and familial tradition are shown in her works through her stylistic choice of quilts in which her family and town built their legacy off of. Grandma Strips is one of Mary Lee Bendolph's most well-known quilts, due to her inspirational basis on which her artwork is based. This particular piece was incorporated through an interpretation of her grandmother in the various strips of fabric included in the quilt. Beginning this analysis with basic elements, it is shown that she utilized non-parallel lines to create abstract square shapes. The regulated lines of the strips in the quilt and an unregulated pattern could provide understanding that the grandmother was wise, but her method was more complex and straightforward in how she shared her wisdom. Most of the fabric strips that she used are classified as geometric shapes with their defined lines, but the abstract fabrics that are seen as the focal points of the quilt do not have any definition to their shape and are therefore seen as organic. The pattern seen throughout the quilt is one of varying sized squares with an irregular system to how the specific strips are placed to create the illusion of the squares. The contrast between the small amount of organic shaped strips and the majority of geometric strips provides a focus on the unique parts that do not seem to belong. The use of brighter colors around the organic strips draw more attention to them and less attention to the darker strips around them. Bendolph purposefully picked these organic strips to abstractly define her grandmother and her inspiration for this quilt. The focal points or important symbols of her grandmother's legacy are the strips showing the leaves and rolling hills, indicating where her grandmother started her family and began her own legacy that Mary Lee has continued. Mary Lee Bendolph provides room for interpretation of what she is attempting to display about her grandmother, but she makes it clear that her work is created through her inspirations, including her grandmother's work. All of her quilts correlate with different inspirations, portraying her reasoning for creating art in this intentional and personal way. Mary Lee Bendolph's legacy of quilts, inspired by her hardships and familial relationships, continues in her work being presented at various museums, such as the Georgia Museum of Art, so that those who are unaware of the legacy and traditions of small rural towns can be made aware of the pieces of history that are created depicting them. Mary Lee Bendolph and her legacy of civil rights and the denial of oppression provide an awakened sense of motivation for those being graced by her quilted works of art.